4-bet pot here with pocket queens. We're gonna start with the 25% size c-bet here. You might beat a board like this. Solver would also have half pots, but I like to keep it simple in 4-bet pots. I don't think it's necessary to have more than one size, so just a quartered pot for all textures is perfectly fine in my opinion as your strategy. On the left we have flop top 2 against well, doesn't matter. Let's continue here with the pocket queens. I think 40% size here. 2 jam rivers with this hand is the best strategy at the moment. Basically here, in terms of a hand reading approach, what I like to think about in 4-bet pots is that if I check, people are unlikely to be able to come up with the proper amount of bluffs. It can be unintuitive sometimes. Also, they might need to find thin value bets that I think humans on average are gonna fail to do enough, so I prefer to put the money in myself, right? That's typically how I'm going to approach most spots. I want to put the money in myself whenever I have the chance. Now this player here has tanked a lot on the turn before calling. That makes his calling range weaker on average. It's still possible that he just has a hand that is a mix between shove and call. So in that sense, it's not like he's completely capped, but at the same time, I believe his range is weaker, and I just want to target a specific region of hands that may fold to a jam, but may find themselves doing this or calling if I size smaller. Right, so I'm obviously doing this to try and induce a bluff with a hand like pocket 7s or pocket 8s. I'm never folding, of course. Turned out that he had the better hand, and he was probably in doubt between jamming and calling on the turn rather than anything else. But still, I think I like my play there. It's a very exploitive play because basically I am targeting specifically some medium pocket pairs that might fold if I jam. In that hand, he just had kings, which I would have lost to anyways if I jammed, so doesn't really matter for that spot, right? So we got ace 9 suited on the left table, ace queen off on the right table. Right, so we have this queen 7 deuce rainbow flop. I'm gonna ISO the fish here on the right table to a big size. I like using big sizes here against these limps to really punish these limpers. On the turn here, ace 9 of diamonds. I'm gonna check, and I might overbluff the river if I have the chance. And here with ace queen, I'm gonna do something funny, which is that I'm going to click this back with the ace queen. So basically the range I'm gonna have here for value is aces and perhaps kings, but I think mostly aces. And ace queen feels almost the perfect hand to basically balance that range with. He decided to make the call. We have an SPR of 1 on the flop. I'm gonna bet small here, as I should with aces and whatever hand I'm gonna have here. And if he jams, no, he just folds. Wow, that's a very quick fold there. Nice. On the left here, I'm going to bet. What? No, I was going to bet with this hand. Not sure what happened. Here on the turn, I'm gonna call and do some bluff raises on the river. I might bluff raise this river, although the 9 is not quite amazing. Anyways, he bets 3/4 pot and then checks on the flush card. I think here I'm gonna turn this hand into a bluff, but I'm gonna use a more medium size, which I would use with king, queen, and ace queen. And that's obviously gonna get him to fold his air, and might also get him to fold some 6x that he hits the river with, like 6-7 or 9-6, something like that. Alright, so I like my bluff there. On the right here, I'm going to open this king 6 suited in this pool. This pool is filled with very tight players, and high cards from the small blind, they very quickly become an open if your opponent is playing tighter than he should, if he's not 3-betting enough, he's not calling enough, and if you account for post flop leaks, then it just becomes a very easy open. So don't get too attached to pre-flop charts that you see on the internet. Pre-flop ranges are going to be extremely sensitive to your opponent's responses, both pre-flop and post-flop. Therefore, always adjust your ranges according to the opponents you have at your table. Here we got called by what seems like two weaker players because they're both short stacked. This flop is amazing for the button. However, this guy is a fish, right? So I'm gonna do something exploitive here, which is to bet small, hoping that he will, with the timing or bet sizing, reveal the strength of his range. So I get called by both the big blind very quickly, which means that he never has a very strong hand here. And the button also did a little bit of a tank call. So basically, I think I'm very ahead of both players' ranges here, and I just want to get value, right? They're gonna have a bunch of, fuck, this time bank. Okay, that's nice. Well, that was a nice compensation for the stupid time bank. Now, we want to target, like, although we're not gonna get raised enough here, which is bad for sizing down, we're basically targeting very weak hands in their ranges. Turned out he hit a 10, had a queen 10 up. Yeah, so basically we're targeting a hand like 4x or pocket 5s or pocket 7s type hands, right? So we're doing a form of exploitative poker that is very focused on hand reading and understanding our opponent's ranges. And this can be very effective if your opponents are predictable, right? This type of strategy, this type of approach is obviously not very good if your opponent is balancing their ranges appropriately, because you may think that they are, predictable, but then they have a balanced range with all sorts of different hand classes. But if your opponents are predictable, and players at this level, a lot of these weaker players are going to be extremely predictable, then just doing this analysis of players' ranges and trying to come up with the best strategy against those most likely hands is going to be certainly a very profitable approach for you. Here on the river in the multi-way pot, I'm just trying to target any one of these players with a small bet here. I feel like this player here, I have a note here of spew reg, not sure why, because there's nothing else written there, just a tag. And this is a spot where he might feel very tempted to bluff raise because he's got so many broadways, right? So many, one pair hands that he feel like could be a good bluff. Even trips there can be a good bluff in that spot. So I was going to call a raise if he decided to raise. On the right here, I'm going to turn my 4 into a bluff in the spot here against the recreational. Basically, a very good strategy against recreational players is to make their ranges wide and then bomb the river. This is going to be very effective because their range is already super wide from pre-flop, and then they float excessively these kinds of small bets. You guys saw that queen 10 off before, right? I just bet small, that low board, and that guy floats queen 10 off, no diamond in a multi-way pot. Like, obviously that hand has no business floating that flop, but they can't help themselves against small bets. So you bet small on the turn, and then you just bomb the next street. That works super well against recreational players, and also against the worst type of regulars, like the weaker regulars, right? Who are they're just gonna massively overfold to your small bets, but then because they have a wider range than they're used to, even though they overfolded the current street, they will still overfold the next street, which is remarkable if you think about it, right? The fact that someone can fold more than they should in consecutive streets shouldn't be possible, right? But it is possible, and in fact, weaker regulars will behave exactly like that, right? Pocket 8s here, we have no weaker players to our left, so I'm gonna play this as a 3-bet. This is not really a hand you should 3-bet much in these positions, but I don't care about the pre-flop charts, right? We are going to play 3-bet pot. 3-bet pot is definitely more profitable to play as a whole than single-raise pots in position as caller. As caller here, my options are very limited because my opponent knows my range is going to be very well defined, right? It's going to be very well defined in pocket pairs and suited connectors. So he basically plays perfectly against my range when I just call, which is not ideal, right? My opponent tanks for some time here and then decides to donk for a 40% pot bet. This is very interesting because the sizing choice is different than I would expect. I'm gonna make a very exploitive play here. So the way I'm thinking about his range here is that it's gonna be a little bit draw heavier than it should, and it's probably not going to contain the amount of 9s and 10s that maybe he should when doing that side, right? I think it's very like 6-5 type hands, pocket 7s, and then a bunch of draws, right? So here's me doing my best attempt at hand reading, because it feels like it's not so intuitive to play like this with, and then he straight up jams the river. The snap jam there. I'm gonna make this call here because I just think he has spades. Wow, so sick. Let's go. Yeah, so let me walk you through why I made this call on the river here. So the snap jam on the king is, I don't know, there's something off about it, right? Because he definitely doesn't snap jam a king. There's a very significant component of timing tails here in this hand. Basically, he never snap jams a king there. So it has to be some kind of 2-pair plus for value, right? But then he already just back called the flop, right? He back called the flop when he could have jammed over the top. So if you think about the sets, if you get raised here, you're gonna think that your opponent is gonna have an overpair quite a lot of the time, right? And it's a draw heavy board, so with his sets, he's very likely to just jam over the top on the flop. And then he didn't donk lead the turn, which might already cap a little bit of his range, because if he did donk the flop, he could perfectly and reasonably think about donking the turn, right? So he just donk calls the flop in a situation where, because of his size, I think it's more of a protection based exactly with this hand type, not so much with some other higher pairs in his range. So that's why I raised the flop. And then on the river, it just feels very off when he does that. It just feels very off when he snap jams the river. It's basically a spot where he's saying, man, I've got 2-pair plus or a bluff. You know, the most likely hand he could have here, I think, is 6-7 suited. I think the way he played, the hand he represents the most is 6-5 suited. But then there's just 2 combos, and there's a lot of missed spades on this renown, right? So I called hoping to see missed spades very often, but he even turned a pocket 7 into a bluff. So that's very interesting here, and I think our read was very good, despite him not having spades on the river as I was expecting. I think he just played his range in a way that is a little bit too face up. Right, so very nice that we were able to be successful. This doesn't necessarily prove that our read was correct, but it's always good to win, right? Ace queen here on the left. I'm gonna go for the check raise because the in-position player here is gonna play very honest with the fish in the pot. So yeah, he checks back after cold calling pre. He's gonna always take a stab with his sets with the fish in the pot. So, well, I shouldn't say always, but it's just like extremely unlikely he's not going to slow play a low 2-tone board with the fish in the pot. So I'm ready to make the assumption that his check back range on the flop is quite weak. And then now on the turn with top pair and flush draw, I'm just hoping the river's a blank so I can go for stacks. The fish so far has played extremely passively, although this guy is very passive in general, very tight. We take down this one. On the right, we have this a7 suited in a small pot. Turned out villain ended up giving up the river. Totally fine. Let's continue here. Pocket 4s. Yeah, you know, these types of calls, if I have a fish to my left, I can convince myself to make the call, but once there's only regs, then your cold calling range becomes so face up, it's really hard to maneuver post flop. So unless you think you can have some extraordinary edge, I typically will avoid these calls because it just makes your range extremely face up, and it's really hard for villain to make a mistake post flop against your range. You know, he knows your range is low pockets and some suited connectors, right? So how is he going to make a mistake against that range? He knows every board that hand hits and the boards that range doesn't hit. So it just gets really hard to bluff your opponent, just get really hard to get value when you hit, right? So I don't think you should be making those calls unless you have some kind of weaker player in the pot. In the situation here with King 10 with the King of Hearts, I like leading here as a bluff. I'm gonna have a lot of 2 pairs, but I'm also gonna have quite a lot of bluffs, quite a lot of gut shots, and generally straight draws and flush draws. So we do have to control our frequencies there if we're thinking about playing a solid strategy. And if you're not at that point yet in your career in poker, if you're not like yet thinking about in frequencies and all that stuff, it's totally fine. There is gonna come a time where you'll be thinking more in depth about that stuff. In general, just keep in mind that if your range is weak and your cold calling range from the big blind against an open is going to be weak by definition, you just can't bet all of your bluffs. You just can't bet all of your draws even, right? Given that you're gonna have this huge amount of draws and not so much value, it should be intuitive to understand that you just can't bet all of those hands before becoming imbalanced, right? Therefore, that's why I said that you have to control your frequencies in that situation. Ace 10 here, we just have a bluff catcher in a spot where he can still check jacks and queens in the spot, and even some king jack suited. Might be close in theory between a bet and a check, but to be honest, the way people play, I heavily prefer check here. It allows us to play way better against his range. If he checks on the river, we can definitely have a value bet here in my opinion. And now that he bets half pot, like honestly, half pot in this situation is so disgusting. Yeah, I ended up timing out, but I think I was going to fold anyway. That is obviously 100% a pure call in theory, okay? Like, any reasonable player should understand that ace 10 there is never a fold in theory. However, again, like, it's a type of situation where, because it's a double Broadway board, it is really easy for him to just fast play all his bluffs, right? It's a king high board. He's got there a bunch of ace jack, ace queen, queen jack. Why would he be checking those hands on the turn? If he's a super theory oriented player who understands that he needs to control his frequency with his bluffs, then he might occasionally find some checks with these hands. But then he's also going to find checks with king jack, as I said, maybe king 9 suited, maybe pocket jacks, pocket queens, right? So it is a spot where I think he has a lot of value and not so many bluffs at all. The way he plays his range, I think it becomes a little bit too face up, and that's why I decided to... I was going to fold anyways on the river. Despite me timing out, I was going to fold. On the left here we have an ace jack 5 two-tone type board where my opponent checks to me, and this is a spot where I think you're gonna have 2 kinds of players. Well, technically you have 3 kinds of players. The players who are going to check range on all boards, small blind versus big blind. There are still some players that play like that to this day, although this used to be more common in the past. There's going to be the player who's going to see bet entire range on high card boards, which was exactly what I was expecting here. And there's the kind of player who will basically play face up where he checks some middling strength hands and then some air, and then he might throw in some traps here and there, but it's mostly a weaker range. Now, for all of those reasons that I mentioned, I'm gonna find this thin value raise here. Might not even been thin value, it's just a standard raise in theory. But the idea here is that the way he has played, he's basically wrapping pocket kings, pocket queens, and then a jack. He doesn't really get here with a realistic amount of clubs and stronger aces. Yeah, so he just thin values the 10 and then calls off. You know, like a 10, queen 10 is probably supposed to be kind of the bottom of his value betting block bet size, I would think. Because ace high boards are not boards that I'm supposed to play very aggressively, therefore I am going to get there with plenty of ace x and jack x, right? He should be able to realize that. Therefore, queen 10 is the bottom of his value betting range, and then he's calling off the bottom of his value betting range, right? So he might be doing that with the assumption that I'm going to be over bluffing. But then what if he's wrong? You know, when you guys are playing, you should be thinking about this. Like, what if I am wrong with my exploitative approach? What if I assume something about my opponent's range and it turns out that I'm mistaken? you should be able to come up with the strategy that is not so vulnerable in the case that you're mistaken. In this case, my opponent is going to be very mistaken. In fact, I think I'm probably going to be under bluffing this spot, because when I look through his range, it's very obvious that he's not going to have many bluffs for this size. And I typically don't like trying to force folds from ranges that don't have air. I might sometimes convince myself to do it out of emotion, but typically speaking, I don't really like trying to force folds from ranges that don't have air. And when he block bets the river here, I know for a fact that the likelihood that he has an air hand with this line on this board is just extremely low, right? So he's making an overcall very likely, because this hand is almost certainly a fold against a raise. So he's making an overcall in a spot where I'm under bluffing, and therefore he is, setting his money on fire. When you're gonna play exploitive strategies, you need a high degree of confidence on what exactly is it that your opponent is doing. If you don't have that high degree of confidence, you're better off just playing a more solid strategy, right? Something more reasonable. Okay, so I really think you guys should be thinking about that before trying to implement some sick exploitive strategy. Here in the multi-way pot, I'm again, now I am playing face up here, extremely face up, but the idea here is that I don't think these players are going to be able to exploit me being face up, and therefore I'm just going to be playing face up because I think that allows me to extract more value from their range. I don't think I'm going to expose myself to enough risks to the point of not being face up myself. And I might, on the 8 I can't. On the blank I could potentially think of squeezing some thinner value, but not realistically here. Right here, I think I have to bet big on this for now. Basically, he doesn't have much air in his range, just like a bunch of one pair hands. And I need to try and get him to fold a 10, 8, or even a jack in this right now. Turns out my hand is perfect bluffing hand. And I do have plenty of strong hands to bet that size with. So I think it's fine. We just ran into 2 pair, right? We have a limper here with 34/7. I'm once again gonna go for the large ISO here, trying to really punish this limper with the very high equity hand. Turns out we get called by another fish from the small blind. He called a very substantial size, and I just have ace queen high here. I'm gonna check this back and reevaluate. This player also has been playing tight so far. Let's take a look and pay attention to his timings. I'm gonna fold this king 7 here to check raise. It's actually kind of a close hand in theory, to be honest, but in practice I think on that board, because the only natural bluffs are some flush draws, people need to check raise a bunch of overcards with backdoors that I think weaker players will very likely not find enough. I think with a hand like that that's probably very close or losing, should be totally fine to fold more. Right, so there, what I'm doing is making an exercise about how I understand theory for that spot. So what do I think a computer should do in that spot? And how do I think my opponents actually play? And based on that assumption, I'm making a deviation. Right, and because I have a lot of experience, because I have studied a lot of solver sims in my life, I think I can have a pretty good understanding of what it's required to be balanced and what my opponents actually do in practice. Right, and because of that, I can allow myself to make these deviations on the fly. Not something I recommend too much for players at low stakes or players that are inexperienced, right? Because the likelihood that you're just going to project the way you think about the game into your opponent is just really high, right? So if you're inexperienced, I would suggest not doing too much intuition-based play. You really should focus on improving your understanding of theory, studying population tendencies whenever you can, so that you can have a sense for how people actually play, right? It's even funny how to this day a lot of people still don't know or don't understand or can't accept the fact that fish over bluff in online poker. And like That could be your intuition if you're playing. I'm gonna fold here because this fish never bluffs. But fish actually massively over bluff, and then therefore if you don't have experience, if you don't study population tendencies, you may make a lot of mistakes with your intuition based play, right? That being said, I think for an experienced player, a player that has played for many years, his intuition is one of his best weapons, right? So I think it's a curve where the more inexperienced you are, the less weight you should give to your intuition, but the more experienced you are, you should exponentially give more value to your intuition, right? So I think that as you get better, as you move up in stakes, as you play more hands, you can rely more and more often into your intuition. But in the beginning, you're just gonna be bad. You're gonna project bad shit into your opponents. You're better off studying theory and studying population tendencies. Okay, so don't make that mistake. Make sure you do a lot of off-the-table work before you start going out there and making assumptions about how people are playing, right? So we have the 7-5 suited here and this pocket tens. We have this cold call from the big blind. Let me make the call before I time out because I would hate to time out here. We have this ace jack 4 board. What I'm gonna do here, I think his range is going to be a little bit too heavy on pocket pairs, and I just want to get those pocket pairs to fold here really, because on ace jack 4, basically the most natural hands for him to check are going to be hands like pocket 7s, pocket 8s, you know, those types of hands, and those types of hands can't really call an overbet. So I really like putting the pressure there on the turn if I have some equity. I'm not gonna do this with any 2 cards, but if I have some equity, I think it's a play that I'm willing to make more often than I'm supposed to. So here, for example, I have to control my frequencies with my draws, right? It's not like I'm gonna be able to bluff all of my straight draws like 5x and flush draws here. But because I think his range is much heavier on pocket pairs than it should, and also less heavy on top pairs than it should, I'm going to allow myself to make this kind of deviation, which is, to get a little bit fancier here, is a kind of a minimally exploitative deviation. So I think my opponent is gonna fold more than he should here, and if that's the case, if you put this in a solver program, you're gonna see the solver starting to blast off with almost any 2 cards, right? If the opponent is very heavy on low pockets, medium pockets, not, and a lot of air as well on that board he could have, but then not heavy enough on top pairs and some slow plays, then you're gonna see the solver blasting off, right? But I'm not gonna blast off because then I reveal too much information about my strategy if I start blasting off on a board where I don't have much business on that board, right? It's supposed to be quote unquote a board for my opponent's range. So if I start blasting off here, I'm just basically revealing to my opponent, hey, I'm heavily over bluffing against you, because just in terms of frequency, he should have an understanding that my frequency of probing that turn should be really, really low. So if I go with an approach that I just bluff any 2 cards, it's just basically very easy for my opponent to realize what I'm doing and quickly adjust, which is not what I want, right? If you have someone giving you money, you want to have them keep giving you money, right? Why would you just, there's a guy on the street that if you get there every time and ask him for money, he's gonna give a little bit of money, but then you just take a medium sum and then the next time he doesn't give you any. You're better off in the long run just having that guy there, right? So that every time you go there and ask, he gives you a little bit of money. In the long run, you're gonna make a lot more money with that approach. That's basically the same thing here. So instead of over bluffing this a few times and taking the money with more hands than I should, and then having this guy adjust, I'm just going to take reasonable bluffing hands, which in this case I have a perfectly reasonable bluffing hand, a double gutter, and I'm going to bet with that instead of bluffing with hands that have no business in that spot, right? With this pocket 9s here, because this guy's shorter stack, I'm gonna do an overfold here because his squeeze range being a short stack is already gonna be stronger, and then with my pocket pair with an effective stack being lower, I'm gonna have lower equity realization, and I still have a player left to act, right? So super 6 spot there for pocket 9s. I think probably better to fold. Jack 9 off here, I get this player with a very quick call on the flop. Honestly, I'm going to blast off here against this timing. So this timing has less nutted hands, but also less air. Now what I'm planning to do with this hand is blast off if some kind of draw completes. Now because the draw didn't complete, I'm gonna go ahead and fold because basically I can't really scare him off if he has a one pair hand, right? If he has King 7 here or 10-9, everything missed, he just has a perfectly reasonable hand, right? But had the board run out with an over card or a draw completing card, then I would bluff, and that's kind of like 40%, 50% of the deck. That's why I decided to barrel despite his timing, right? Because his timing is not ideal for a bluffing hand, to be honest, okay? When your opponent calls very fast, he's signaling to you that he has a form of middling strength hand. Basically a hand he never, let me see this guy here, the big blind. Basically a hand he never considered raising and a hand he never considered folding. That's why he played very fast, right? A hand that you never considered raising and you never considered folding is what? Is exactly a middling strength hand. Some kind of top pair with kicker, some kind of middle pair. And sometimes some draws as well that you mostly fast play with, right? Ace Queen here is very close between all options if you look at a GTO chart. In this pool, I think it's probably better as either a 4-bet given the player or as a fold. There's always a dilemma when you're facing tighter players, which I think was the case for that guy, which is like, okay, am I gonna 4-bet tighter because he is tighter, so his initial 3-bet range is stronger than it should? Or am I going to 4-bet more because I think a tighter player would not defend well against 4-bets? In fact, you have that dilemma. It all depends on your opponent's response, right? So how does he respond to 4-bets? Is he tight and then because he's tight, he never folds to 4-bets? Or is he tight and then he can still find folds against 4-bets? That's the question you're going to have to ask yourself, and then you're going to have to act accordingly, right? King Queen off here, I'm going to place this 4-bet here. It's really hard for the other position player to defend against 4-bets in these positions. Like, he still has to call a bunch of suited connected hands, pocket pairs, and then he's gonna go post flop against a linear uncapped range. He's gonna face barrels, and it's just a super difficult spot for the other position player. So I like to be aggressive here with in position 4-bets. I think this hand also perfectly reasonable to have in my 4-betting range, right? And that's why I decided to go for it this time. Unfortunately, he had a jamming hand this occasion. I'm gonna 3-bet this a6 against this player. I find Chinese players to be interesting. Obviously, China is a huge country, and probably it's not possible to have like super general reads. But I have seen like two types of Chinese players. Some that are very wide and willing to gamble. There are fish and also some regulars. And then another spectrum of players who are just very tight and face up. Right, so I feel like Chinese players are polarized in that regard. Not sure if my read is wrong, but I do have that feeling. And then, well, I'm going to be testing out here in this pool, perhaps clicking some buttons and seeing how these players respond. That's how typically I like to approach. We have this player here who's playing extremely tight. I'm not sure we can jam with this SPR, but I'm going to try something different here, which is a 4x open, which should be close in theory. And then basically I just want to decrease his jamming frequency in a spot where I already think he's going to under 3-bet, but then if I size up a little bit, he's going to under 3-bet even more, right? Let's isolate this fish here once again, punishing them with a big size. We find another 3-bet here. It seems like these players are interpreting my 6x ISO as some form of weak range, and I've gotten 3-bet very often. And then he snap clicks. Yeah, because of the snap click, I'm going to fold. But it's actually tempting to go into the leveling war here because I think I'm getting disproportionately 3-bet when I am ISOing these fishes. Anyways, on the right here we have Queen Jack, which is a pretty standard call. His sizing was interesting on the flop. Anyways, on the turn we're gonna have a quite polar betting range. It's the type of spot where you have no reason to bet for thin value, right? Basically, you have no reason to bet for thin value. In theory, he should have some slow plays here on the turn. Hands like pocket sevens and pocket queens are amazing checks for him as the out of position player. So he bet check bets with the overbet size here. I think my hand is a call in theory. Now in practice, it might be that I'm still gonna make the call, but I think it could be a spot where he's going with the thinner value bet strategy, knowing that my range, and it's tough to explain to be honest, but I have a feeling that some players might approach that spot as more of a thin value bet spot rather than an over bluff spot. But since I'm not super confident, I'm just gonna make the call with the hand that I think is a very reasonable bluff catcher in that situation. 9-8 suited is a hand that is close. It kind of suffers in realization if your opponents on your left are gonna 3-bet a lot. In this pool, I'm not so sure yet what's the meta, whether players are under 3-betting or over 3-betting. King 10 here, I'm gonna find a check. Betting would be perfectly reasonable as well. And now I'm gonna start bluffing in both spots. Small size on a third to flush ace, half pot size on a low board. We get snap called, and he donk leads for a half pot. Can't we find a bluff raise here? Can we find a bluff raise against this? I'm gonna fold this one. But there are some lines that fish don't bet the river that you can actually bluff raise against. Fishes just have very weak ranges in most lines. And those weak ranges are going to be very overbluffed, and this leads to high folding frequency to raises, although not as high as you would think, or at least not as high as you would expect when someone has such a weak range as they do. Therefore, there are some lines that if you have the proper hand for it, it can actually be quite profitable to bluff raise. On the right here, it seems like we're playing a fish again. I guess fish is, I guess the regular who has a pretty tight cold calling range, this can be a high frequency check spot. Against a fish who has a super wide cold calling range and is gonna make quite a lot of mistakes when I bet, I prefer to bet myself and just fast play at the flop. Then on this card it becomes a very easy check call. On the left we check called with the queen jack and queen 10 deuce. Kind of the board texture where he might bet too much with his draws and keep doing so on the turn. So many gut shots and straight draws and flush draws available. So I think we just call the turn to fold most rivers. I ended up checking here, but I think I wanted to value bet for the most part. Interesting river card. It's gonna find a lot of checks with ace jack and some ace king if he has it. And he gives up with, yeah, ace king. Sick river. Ah, fuck! Oh, no. I was going to raise the king jack. This time bank is so stupid. Like, I even have it as... like auto time bank card always. Why doesn't it activate? Did I not have a card to use? That's so stupid, man. See what I do for you guys. Playing while explaining requires some more time and deliberation sometimes. I make this mistake of timing out, which sucks, but it's okay. Let's continue here. Hopefully the session has been useful for you guys to learn something new, to just basically understand poker strategies on a more deeper level. 10-9 suited here, I'm going to 3-bet. This 10-9 suited feels like a good squeeze, at the same time feels like a reasonable call. I'm going to make the call, although squeezing feels perfectly fine as well. Yeah, so against a kind of a snap bet and a snap call, I'm just folding this. I think it's actually even quite of an easy fold, to be honest. It might be a spot where a lot of players overcall here. In multi-way pots, basically your thresholds have to be so much tighter. You can't really get away with making these calls when you're just splitting the pot with other two players. You know, it's just your equity decreases a lot, your realization decreases a lot, because the chance that another bet is going to come in from someone on the next tree is so high. If you're not drawing to the nuts, you're toasted as well. So yeah, gotta be quite tight in those multi-way spots. And the good news is that if most people are going to be overcalling those multi-way spots, you can play very value oriented and you're going to print money, right? The way people play, it's basically just a very easy spot generate edge. You just fast play your value most of the time, and people are just gonna make the mistake of overcalling for you, even though they have absolutely no reason to. Because they don't understand the thresholds, they're going to end up overcalling for you. Ace 10 here, we floated on a paired board with the ace of spades, feels perfectly reasonable. Then we have this pair on the turn. He ends up tanking and finds the check. Quite interesting here because most of the bluffs are very intuitive. And then tanking hands are gonna be what? Some medium queen X's, some 10 X's, maybe some non-intuitive ace-X bluffs. You know, for that reason, I'm gonna go for a medium size here, just basically targeting those types of hands in his range. Yeah, so some medium ace-X, I guess, is what he had. Basically trying to figure out, okay, should I bluff ace highs here or not? In fact, that's actually quite an interesting question, because you would think you don't, right? But I have done this analysis very recently to my Cash Made Simple community, my community for cash game players, and I did a video that is called, in the community it's called Dose of Green Line, where I talk about theory heuristics. And I showed in that video how you actually have to barrel ace highs quite a lot in the double barrel line, particularly cutoff versus big blind or tighter. Button versus big blind, we have the proper heuristics, which is like almost no double barreling with ace highs. But when you take a look at cutoff or tighter formations, you actually have to barrel a decent amount of ace highs in double barrel line, which was quite eye-opening for me to see. So in that spot, I'm not saying ace 8 offsuit with no blocker there is a barrel at some frequency, but I would absolutely not be surprised if he should barrel a decent amount of ace highs there. For example, some ace highs that I think could definitely be barrels there is going to be like ace deuce, ace 3, ace 4, ace 5 maybe type hands, right? Those low kicker ace-X feels to me like they could be very reasonable barrels on the turn. Ace 8, ace 9, I think they're gonna be closer because they're gonna be blocking some folds. But anyways, I think he does have a decision there with some of his ace high hands, and his timing tell did give me that vibe, right? So some kind of like weak queen, some kind of 10, some kind of ace high that is in doubt between betting or checking, right? So we have the 10-7 here. This is a spot where I don't have, once again, the time bank. I don't have a strong opinion on whether you should be more aggressive or less aggressive than theory. This player quickly bets half pot. I'm gonna go for the fast play here. This is a line where people might struggle to put enough money into the pot with hands like pair plus heart and even some queen X's value bets. They might be too conservative with those hands. So if your opponent is not going to put money to the pot for you, you should just build the pot yourself. That's generally what I'm going to try to do whenever I can sense that the way people naturally play might be a little bit too passively compared to how a computer would play. Okay, so that's why I decided to fast play there. Again, like in terms of having a balanced range, you can't just always raise your flushes, right? It's pretty clear to see that if you always raise your flushes, every time you call, you're just fucked because your opponent's gonna have tons of flushes. You have none. He can take like a queen and start massively overbetting a queen because you never have flushes. And then because he's doing that, imagine the amount of bluffs he's able to have in his range. And once that happens, what happens to your bluff catchers? You don't get to show down almost ever anymore because he just has like such a thin value range and he can overbluff so much. You're gonna be super fucked, right? So your value bets, even though I don't like this term at all, but I'm gonna use it anyways, a lot of times they're going to serve to protect your middling strength hands. If your middling strength hands don't have company and your opponent knows that, of course he needs to know that for it to take effect. If your middling strength hands don't have the company of strong hands, they are essentially fucked because the opponent can play super thin value bets and for that reason bluff more. For that reason you can't get to showdown with your middling strength hands, which is absolutely what they need to make money, right? So this is a theory concept that is really important, and then once you understand that theory concept, you can get better at constructing better ranges. Because imagine a spot where you have few nutty hands and a lot of middling strength hands. What is it that you're going to have to do? Your nutty hands, they have to follow the middling strength hands. So poker is a game where hands need company, right? So if you have lots of middling hands and not so many nutty hands, then what's going to happen is that your nuts are going to have to play exactly the way your middling strength hands want to play. If your middling hands want to bet small, your nuts are going to have to bet small. If your middling hands want to check, your strong hands are going to want to check, right? So you have to pay a lot of attention to this because it can definitely be problematic for your strategy, for your middling strength hands to not have the appropriate company that they need. We're flopping sets left and right here, or mostly left because he was on the left table that we did that. I did decide to overbet here the turn with the King of Spades and the Eight of Hearts are amazing hands to have there because they completely unblock my opponent's folds. Let me talk more about that. And they block some of my opponent's calls, right? So he doesn't ever float King X of Spades on the flop. Like, it makes no sense. He has no hands like that. But he might have a hand like King Jack in his range. And then he's gonna have some flush draws with an 8 that he might also call, right? Some Ace 8 of Hearts, some Queen 8 of Hearts, some 8 7 of Hearts, 8 6 of Hearts that he's never going to fold. Therefore, I have an overcard which gives me equity. Ooh, I have here a raise. I have an overcard that gives me equity, and I have the perfect blockers. I have unblockers to folding range. Ooh, that's a cooler. I'm sorry, my friend. I said thank you. No, I didn't mean to say thank you. I meant to say sorry. Fuck. Yeah, I meant to say sorry, my friend. They made this too. Very similar. Yeah, so that's the idea. You know, like a combination of equity and blockers. Typically speaking, that's what you should be thinking about when deciding which hands to bluff and for what size to bluff. I don't think this is a call here, really. Anyways, the equity of your hand and the blockers of your hand. Sometimes the blockers are more important than the equity. You know that? Yeah, there are a lot of spots in theory where despite having a high equity hand, you should actually not bluff with it. Because your blockers are so bad and you have better options, right? That kind of range awareness is actually also very important. Like, your hands are only good or bad relative to the other hands that you could have. That's a good one. That's a good one. Not many people realize that. Not many people realize that. For instance, people have that loose heuristic that, oh, I should not bet miss flush draws. Really? If you study solver behavior, you're going to see solver bluffing miss flush draws in quite a lot of spots. Now, the idea here is that your hands are only good or bad relative to the other hands you could potentially have. So imagine you're in a spot where you don't actually have better bluffs than missed flush draws. Like, maybe you have some small amount of missed straight draws, but like the bulk of your bluff range is missed flush draw. Then you don't care about the blockers anymore, right? Because it's all you have as a bluff. Therefore, it shouldn't matter. Your bluffs, your blockers are only good or bad relative to the other blockers you can have in your range. And it's the job of your opponent to come up with a bluff catching strategy that makes whatever blockers you have indifferent. Okay, this is actually too advanced for this video. I shouldn't be talking about this topic, but yeah, so your blockers are only good or bad relative to the other hands you have in your range, which your opponent is going to have to take into account when building his bluff catching strategy. His bluff catching strategy needs to take into account what quality of blockers you have and build a bluff catching strategy that reflects the quality of your blockers. Okay, so that's a little bit more advanced. Maybe for another video I can talk a little bit more about that, right? So far so good. We ran through a period there where we were not making any money and not winning any pots, and now we have won some pots in a row, which is nice. Jack 8 here, we have this player limp and then snap calling. I'm not sure what to make of people's limping ranges in these spots. I think overall it might be a very imbalanced range. So I'm gonna go here with the bet on the flop. Didn't pick up any equity on the turn. Could still be a reasonable barrel on the turn, really. Given that he snap called though, I'm going to select maybe higher quality bluffs to keep barreling here. And on this ace, I'm just going to give up. Like, this is a situation where he's gonna lead all his bluffs. Well, not all his bluffs, but most of his bluffs. And I'm gonna get check raised a ton. And it's just very hard to get him off whatever hand he's got there, especially because I can't really wrap an ace much. Like in the spot, like if you do some self-awareness exercise, like do we really bet too many ace-X on the flop? We actually do. We do have some ace-X offsuit with the heart, and we do have some ace-X of hearts. But at the same time, the proportion of those hands relative to the proportion of airs we have is just really small, right? So it's once again a situation where if you're thinking about your own range, again, it becomes obvious that you need to do some form of controlling your frequencies, you know? I think in the spot, I actually still have to 3-bet this. I was thinking like maybe because of 50 big blind stack depth, we don't, but I think we still do. I think we still 3-bet this even at 50 bigs. I never studied 50 bigs, so don't quote me on that. You know, so like if you do some self-awareness exercise, like what is my range here? Right? Like you should be thinking of that in all spots. Like, what is my range? What are the hands I get here with? And once you do that process, it kind of becomes obvious that, well, maybe you don't have many hands to value bet. You have all of these garbage hands. Your opponent is completely uncapped. So like, are you really gonna try to bluff here? You know, it becomes pretty clear that the proportion of bluffs you have combined with the proportion of value you have, you just have to control your bluffing frequencies like dramatically. And if you're not thinking about ranges, what is going to happen? You're going to over bluff the spot, and then your opponent's going to overcall, and then you're fucked because obviously you just lost a bunch of money. This is something that is kind of an understanding of red line leagues that people don't realize. Like red lines and blue lines, actually, both in this case. When you try to wrap things that you can't wrap and you're just trying to force folds, your fold equity is going to be super low. And that's going to be a problem for your red line and for your blue line, right? If your bluffs don't get through, your red line suffers, your blue line suffers, right? So a lot of the problems you might have when it comes to red line is because you're just not thinking of ranges. You're being aggressive in spots that you shouldn't, and maybe you're being passive in spots that you should be aggressive. So a lot of stuff could be solved if you were just more deliberate in actually thinking through the ranges, because it's generally not super difficult to think through the ranges. It's often a bigger struggle to actually have the habit of thinking through the ranges all the time. You know, sometimes we just click buttons. That's the truth. Like here on the left, for example, my range definitely looks weaker, but I'm gonna use that to my advantage because my opponent's range contains a lot of potential bluffing hands, and I think it's hard for people to come up with the proper check raising strategies. So see, like, this is why I love poker, and even though it's 2025, actually, let me rephrase. This hand doesn't say anything because he just played his hand exactly like he should. So let's not pretend he made a mistake here. But what I would like to say about this hand is that sometimes you can be extremely face up about your strategy and nothing is going to happen because your opponent has already fucked up his range in a way that he can't really fight back. So in that circumstance, let me call one here and then reevaluate. Yeah. In the spot here, when he checks, because of his initial mistake, which is in my opinion here will be to not slow play enough value. So he should take a number of his two-pair hands, particularly I would say sets and some flushes, and check on the river to properly balance the fact that his 8x, Queen X, pocket 10s with the diamond, pocket 9s with the diamond, pocket jacks with the diamond type hands, they need company, right? If he always only checks Queen Jack, Queen 10, pocket jacks, pocket 10s, pocket 9s, and 8-7 suited, I can take a hand like this, and if he is defending properly, I could just overbet for value, which is of course not the right play in theory, but because he's super capped, I could do that. And then I could take a shit ton of my bluffs and start bluffing because now I have so much value and I'm betting so big. Now, because I am pretty sure, based on what I know about population, that he doesn't protect this checking range enough, what I can do is I can say, okay, well, yeah, man, I think you have jacks, Queen X, and 9s a shitload of the time here. So I'm just going to bet an amount I'm pretty sure you're going to call with those hands. And if I size up, you might fold with those hands. But not only am I going to bet an amount that I think you're going to call with these hands, but I'm also going to bet an amount that you might get tempted to bluff raise me. And since I know you don't have the value anymore, I'm just going to call you off if you raise. And then you're going to be over bluffing in a spot where I thin value bet you. And I called your raise. So I basically fucked you. And, you know, I threw the bait and you fell for it, you know. So if you study theory, if you study population tendencies, and if you play a lot to develop some awareness of how population plays, you can pull off spots like this, where you can thin value a hand like this, which I don't think it's a thin value, it's like a standard half pot reopen kind of hand. But I would be very happy to reopen a hand like Queen Jack for a small size here, for example. Because I know that, yeah, he beats with ace queen, but I blocked that, and then I just want to get some thinner value. And I know that if he raises, I'm going to call him off. It's going to be over bluffing. So, you know, that's less in the hand reading kind of camp. I guess it's both. Like, it's both hand reading, but also with significant understanding of population behavior combined with an understanding and knowledge about how much of these out of position spots are so hard to balance because it requires the unnatural action of playing passively with the nutted hand. It is extremely unnatural to play passively with the nutted hand. And if you study solvers, if you study theory, you're gonna realize that, okay, it might be unnatural, but it is absolutely required. It is absolutely required to play passively sometimes with your nutted hands. If you don't do that, you're gonna be fucked. Yeah, you're gonna be fucked. Like, there's no way you can play solid poker against a solid opponent without playing passively with your value quite a lot of the time. But because that is so unnatural, because it's so tempting to just go for the reward, right? It's kind of like the nutted hand is the golden ticket in poker, right? It's the dopamine hit. Where do you get the dopamine hit? Sometimes from a successful bluff, right? Because it's nice to run bluffs. But most of the time, like, you get from hitting that very good hand and going for value, right? So when you have, I'm not sure about this. Like, it feels like a standard call, but I'm not sure how much people are squeezing in this pool. So it feels so good to just go ahead and fast play your value, right? And then because people are not doing this enough, you get to expand, you get to thin value bet, and then call people's raises. Queen 6 feels a little bit too wide for min raise. I think Queen 7 off is probably a better threshold. 7-6 suited. Feels tempting to 3-bet. Let's go with the call this time. Ace 10 4 2, like that's a very interesting board to see how he plays. Well, he played the only sizing I wasn't expecting him to play. I was expecting him to play big bets or checks or like small bets with range. And then he picked something in the middle, which to me kind of feels like he might be a weaker player. Like half pot on this board. Who is the regular that plays half pot on this board, right? Feels weird. Anyways, he goes half and then checks on the 10. Like, this is a spot that, again, my range is just perceived as so strong, right? I called ace 10 4, then the turn came the 10 of diamonds. I have lots of aces, I have lots of diamonds, I have lots of 10s. So if I just go bombing here, he folds everything. So how do I make sure I get called by pocket kings here or by ace 7? You gotta throw in an exploitative sizing, right? You basically, if you're gonna play a max exploit strategy, you just bet big with your bluffs and you bet smaller with your value. And then people are gonna fold your big bet and they're gonna click call with their bluff catcher because you know what? It's just a small bet, you know? Yeah, let's see what they have, right? They will force themselves into clicking the call button because they don't have clairvoyance about your range. This is a concept that gets thrown around in theory talk, and if you study with solvers, you know, the only way solvers can come up with unexploitable strategies and GTO solutions is because the solver knows the other player's range at all times. The solver knows exactly the composition of the other player's range in every node. And if the player adjusts his composition, the solver immediately adjusts back. Now, your opponents don't have that clairvoyance. If I bet half pot with my value and then size up my bluffs, my opponent cannot immediately know that. Therefore, it creates a circumstance that incentivizes some exploitative play, but of course with the understanding that you can't do that all the time because then you're revealing information, right? Let's see here. Nice. I have a note here from this player where it seems like he's trying to get tricky with his value bets, and it seems like he checks obvious value bets bust, then try and funnel value into other lines. So I'm actually just gonna fold here my pocket sixes against pot, which I think would already be close anyway. And on the right here we have 8-7 that we block bet and then call the raise. The ace river is interesting. It creates a dynamic where he's tanking. Creates a dynamic where, yeah, I figured this much, buddy. I figured this much. It creates a dynamic that you're gonna have two types of players. The player who is gonna massively under bluff, the player who's gonna massively over bluff. There are only two types of players here on this card, okay? Only two cards of players. It just creates a dynamic where it feels weird, right? He raises the turn, he's like, I mean, I don't have ace-X raising the turn, right? If he's a reasonable player who thinks in ranges, he's like, yeah, man, this card, not ideal for me. I don't really raise ace-X on the turn. And my opponent has ace-X of clubs. He has ace-9, ace-8, perhaps ace-5. So he's got two pairs. He's got ace-X. I got no ace-X. So the only way I can value bet this is if I have two pair plus, right? So am I gonna try and wrap two pair plus here? If I try to wrap two pair plus, I'm gonna have to overbet this. Because if I bet 3/4 pot, I'm gonna get a snap call because I wrap nothing, right? So it creates this dynamic where typically the guy is gonna convince himself not to bluff. He's typically gonna convince himself not to bluff because it just feels too awkward, right? It just feels awkward to bluff in a spot where he knows his value range is quite limited. So he has some kind of intuitive notion that he should be controlling his frequencies. But then, because he doesn't have a process for controlling his frequencies, he's just gonna give up. And by the time he gives up every time, it's not like he's controlling his frequencies, he's just under bluffing. Like, he just has no bluffs when he bets. So that's a spot where most players are gonna massively underbluff. And then there are gonna be some players who are gonna be like, okay, yeah, I mean, fuck, I don't have much value now, but I mean, I do still have that 2-pair plus that I raised on the turn, right? And I can put pressure to his bluff catchers on this card. And to do that, I'm gonna have to put a massive bet here. So there are gonna be the players who are gonna massively underbluff and are gonna give up everything, and the players who are going to put massive bets with an overbluffed range. There are only these two types of players in this spot. On the left here, basically trying to overbluff here against his region of pocket pairs and suited connectors. He decided to snap call, which is interesting. And here I'm actually going to go for it because I have a lot of ace-x in my range, and he might still snap check call with some 6x jack x type hands. Didn't work this time because he did have the ace, but it is a spot where as I said, I generally don't like bluffing too many ranges that don't have airs, and that's a very typical range. He never has air there. But given his pre-flop cold calling range, given the fact that he might still call one because he feels like he's just stabbing on the ace, right? Then he might call one to fold too much on the river, right? He might call one to end up folding too much with his region of 1-pair hands. Not work that time. Didn't work that time. 10-9-3 gonna be a board where I will check back some of these weaker top pairs. They function very well as slow plays, and they can call 2 bets very easily. It's like super easy to play once you check. Turn ace, I can technically still get called by worse if I bet here, but it's kind of a 1 street of value hand. I have to choose, do I get that 1 street now or on the river? I feel like on the river is much better. I have a lot of ace-x to value bet on the turn anyway. And by checking, I also capture some value from his air, which I never do if I bet the turn. Right, so if I bet the turn, I only get value from some weaker 10s and 9s. If I check, I can still get that value from weaker 10s and 9s on the river. And I still get value from some airs that he's going to bluff me. He's going to try to bluff me. Oh, fuck it. Once again, I checked. Okay, but that was... okay, that helped me. That timeout actually helped me this time, so I'm happy about that one. He ended up checking turn and river. Checking the turn, kind of okay. Although typically people slow play a lot more than they should on the ace. Yes, it is a card that, you know, your opponent's gonna reopen some amount, and then it makes sense to have some slow plays, because then if your opponent's gonna reopen a lot, that increases the value of slow play. You just have high AV as slow play because your opponent's putting money at the pot for you, right? But people kind of overdo that, and it gets kind of intuitive to say that, yeah, I think my opponent's too protected here, I'm just gonna check back more. Right, so it's kind of like you get to a point where people do it so much that it becomes ineffective, you know. I'm double barreling the pocket kings here with the half pot size. I'm getting raised with this 3x size. I still have the call here with the king of clubs. I'm not feeling happy about it. Might be a no. Wow, he snap pots. So sick. Do you have those quads, my friend? I think you do, right? I mean, fuck! Jesus. This is so sick. This time bank thing is so disgusting. It is so incredibly disgusting, this time bank thing. Absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I was gonna call there because people can do some weird shit when they feel like you're capped. And they're like, oh, he half pots the pairing cards. I have to bluff him off now. And then he kind of commits the plan, you know? It's going to be the same, kind of a same polarizing spot as I said about the ace on the river in that hand. In that jack on the river, let's go back to that. on that jack here on this river, he showed a 7. Yeah, motherfucker. I think he was bluffing. Yeah, I was gonna call. In this circumstance, you have two types of players: the player who will massively under bluff and give up everything, and the player who will massively over bluff, because he's like, nah, I gotta keep representing, right? I mean, I gotta keep representing. He just forgets that because there's another jack on the board, the amount of combos that he could actually have a jack with are just really, really small, right? So they don't control their frequencies properly. They kind of get into that character that they need to represent the hand, and then they end up massively over bluffing, right? So I got two types of players here: the player who will never bluff, and the player who will massively over bluff. Your job as a poker player is to be able to get to a level that you can quickly and accurately identify those types of players. You need to be able to quickly look at your opponent, and based on his tendencies and the past behavior, figure out whether he belongs to group 1 or group 2. That's what you gotta do. And if you're accurate with that assumption, you're gonna make a lot of money, because you're gonna be exploiting people very hard, right? You know the people that under bluff, and you know that people that over bluff. And in that spot, I don't know, something about his timings were very off to me. Also, his stats were running kind of fishy stats, so could be a recreational player. So basically, you need to get good at identifying these types of players and reacting accordingly whenever you have the chance, right? On the left here, my opponent is c-betting small on 10-9-6. He might be c-betting a bit too much, a tax turn in which he should find some checks. So I'm going to overfloat here. Maybe this hand is not even an overfloat, I don't know. 2 overs in the ace of diamonds feels okay, although we are against the hijack. But because he's likely over c-betting, which causes him to over check the turn, I'm going to overcall the flop. Okay, so basically the fact that he over c-bets at the very minimum causes my equity realization to increase, because typically speaking, if someone over c-bets the flop, this leads to a higher checking frequency on the turn. And if he checks more often than he should on the turn, I get to see the river more often and realize the equity of my hand, right? So I like to overfloat against people who might be over c-betting. And then I also get to over bluff some runouts. I decided not to over bluff this one. Feels difficult to get him off a 1 pair hand here. And of course, I beat all the rest. There is a theme of bluffing off worse hands. So what's the problem there? You just saw the rationalization that I made, right? Oh, I'm not gonna bluff because it's hard to get a 1 pair hand to fold, and the other hands that I am already beating. Now the problem is that I'm not gonna get to show down against all the hands that I'm already beating. I'm gonna get bluffed sometimes, right? So here comes a very important theoretical concept in poker, which is the idea that it is absolutely part of theory in poker to bluff off worse hands. It is absolutely part of theory in poker to bluff off worse hands. A lot of people call this protection, right? Oh, I'm going to protect my hand. Typically, when people think about protection, they are thinking about preventing their opponents from outdrawing them, right? The opponent has an overcard, the opponent has a draw, so I'm gonna protect my hand. I'm gonna bet to prevent my opponent from overdrawing. No, what's the word for it? Anyways, from picking up his outs and beating my current hand, right? What people don't realize is that the actual biggest threat to your middling strength hands is not your opponent's overcards or drawing hands pick up their outs. It's the fact that they're gonna bluff you if you let them. They're gonna bluff you. They're just gonna take stabs at the pot and they're gonna have to fold. So even though you're already beating these hands, you can't get to show down against them all the time, right? If poker was a game where you just could realize 100% of your equity, oh, I'm beating all these weaker hands now, just give me my money, it would be much easier and much, it just would be much less fun to play, right? Now, because such a thing doesn't exist, because you can't realize 100% of your equity against the hands you're already beating, sometimes it's preferable for you to bluff those worse hands off than let them bluff you. Take a look at that. That's actually a super important theoretical concept. I call it the third reason for betting. And it's actually the reason why blocking bets exist in this game. Not the only reason, but the primary reason. The primary reason blocking bets exist on the flop, on the turn, and on the river out of position is because your middling straight hands, they benefit tremendously from getting your opponent to fold a worse hand, because the alternative a lot of times is allowing those hands to bluff you off. So what you do, you place those blocking bets. You place those preemptive bets. I love this term. This is a term that I got to know by reading the Mathematics of Poker book by Bu Chen, and he calls blocking bets preemptive bets. I love this term. Right? So you want to prevent your opponent from playing more aggressively than playing as aggressively as he would like to. So you go ahead and you block bet with middling straight hands with the objective sometimes to just get him to fold these hands that could bluff you off. And then you could say, okay, Sala, but then, well, can't he just bluff raise you? And that would be a very good question. In fact, he can, but what is it that you're going to do? Because you want to block bet those hands and make your opponent fold worse hands so that they can't bluff you off, he's going to start trying to bluff raise you, obviously. But then by the time he starts to bluff raise you, what's going to happen? You gain value with your nuts. That's super cool, right? That's super cool. You start to get value from air with your nuts. And think about it. With your nuts, it's awesome for that to happen, because sometimes with your nuts, sometimes no, most of the time with your nuts, if you size up, which is what you would want to do with your nut hand, you're not going to get value from air, from bluffing hands. You're just going to get value from bluff catchers. Now, what if your opponent doesn't have many bluff catchers but has a lot of air? Should you try to get called by bluff catchers, or should you try to get raised by the air? You should try to get raised by the air. That's why in equity distribution matchups where you have quite a lot of middling straight hands and some nuts, and your opponent has a lot of air, you're gonna block bet because your middling straight hands want to get that air to fold. By the time you block bet, those airs are gonna start raising you, and by the time those airs start raising you, your nuts really likes to block bet now because it's getting value from the air. And then your opponent needs to bluff only at the exact frequency that makes your blocking bets indifferent between betting and checking. Your opponent needs to come up with the exact raising frequency that makes block betting and checking exactly the same EV with your middling straight hands. That's the theoretical concept behind, kind of tempting to call here, but this is just so out there in the bottom. That's the concept behind the third reason for betting in poker. We have been running this for more than an hour now, so I hope you guys enjoyed the session. This is a different session that I'm used to making, more on a conversational style, not like so heavy on editing as I typically like to make my videos, particularly the play and explain ones. So hope you guys enjoyed. Leave me some feedback here in the comments if you'd like to see more play and explains like this. And well, I guess I'll see you guys in the next video.